Steam rises over open fields as machines begin their day, not in a city of steel and smoke, but in the quiet countryside. This is the Gilded Age, an era remembered for mansions, rail tycoons, and glittering excess. Yet far from the skylines, another empire is already operating at a scale just as vast and far more disciplined. It owns no famous towers and hosts no lavish parties. Instead, it controls land, labor, science, and supply with industrial precision. This empire feeds cities, shapes markets, and rewrites how agriculture works, all while remaining largely unseen. When public anger turns against extreme wealth, it does not collapse or fight back. It adapts, fragments, and disappears into normal life. History does not destroy it. America looks past it. This is the story of the Gilded Age Empire. America chose to forget. The countryside looks calm from a distance. Low hills roll outward, fields stretch to the tree line, and barns sit in neat alignment, as if placed by a ruler. But as you move closer, the calm breaks apart. Wagons follow fixed routes at precise hours. Steam rises from buildings that do not house animals or families, but engines and boilers. Bells signal shifts, not meals. This land does not breathe like a traditional farm. It operates. In the final decades of the 19th century, America is expanding faster than its own imagination. Cities swell with immigrants and machines. Steel pours from furnaces, rail lines cut through mountains, and oil wells turn quiet land into sudden fortunes. Public attention stays fixed on skylines and smokestacks. Power is measured in height, noise, and speed. Yet far from the cities, another idea of power is taking shape. It grows without towers. It does not announce itself. It spreads through soil, data, and repetition. This empire begins with land, but not land treated as inheritance or tradition. It is land treated as a system. Each acre is surveyed, drained, amended, and recorded. Soil samples are taken and compared. Crop yields are logged year after year. Failure is not accepted as fate or weather. Failure is treated as a problem to be solved. Where older farms rely on memory and instinct, this operation relies on records, charts, and controlled trials. You can feel the difference the moment you step inside its boundaries. Everything has a purpose and a measurement. Barns are spaced to reduce wasted steps. Roads curve to match load limits and turning radii. Water flows where gravity is calculated, not guessed. Even the animals move through planned cycles. Birth, growth, labor, and culling follow schedules drawn out months in advance. The men running this system do not dress like aristocrats. Most wear work coats, boots, and hats stained by use. They speak the language of efficiency, not luxury. Their pride comes from output, not display. This is not a retreat from industry into nature. It is industry pushed directly into nature, forcing the land to obey the same logic as a factory floor. By the 1890s, the scale becomes difficult to grasp. Thousands of workers are spread across fields, barns, mills, and workshops. Some specialize in animal health. Others focus only on irrigation. Others track transport, storage, and waste. Each task feeds into another. Nothing stands alone. A failed harvest affects livestock feed. Livestock losses affect fertilizer supply. Fertilizer changes affect next year's soil balance. Every decision echoes forward. This is what makes the operation powerful. It does not rely on one product or one market. It produces food, raw materials, experimental results, and trained expertise all at once. It sells crops, but it also sells methods. Visitors arrive from universities, government offices, and foreign delegations. They walk the fields and take notes. They see a vision of the future that feels both practical and unsettling. For generations, American farming has been personal. Families pass down land and habits. Mistakes are absorbed slowly. Success is local. This empire breaks that rhythm. It treats farming as a science that can be standardized, scaled, and exported. What works here should work anywhere if the rules are followed closely enough. Nature becomes something to be managed rather than respected. At first, this ambition excites the era. The Gilded Age believes deeply in progress. If steel can be perfected, why not soil? If railroads can be timed to the minute, why not harvests? Newspapers praise innovation. Politicians speak of abundance. The countryside, once seen as backward, now appears modern. But even in these early years, tension quietly builds. The system requires enormous capital. Land must be purchased in continuous blocks. Equipment must be imported or custom built. Specialists must be trained and paid year-round, not just at harvest. This level of investment concentrates power in ways that feel unfamiliar outside cities. Small farmers nearby notice changes. Prices shift as large volumes enter markets. Techniques spread unevenly. Those without capital cannot compete on scale, yet are expected to match efficiency. What was once a shared landscape begins to feel divided. The empire does not threaten with force, it threatens by example. Inside the operation, the pace never slows. Experiments are running constantly. New crop varieties are planted in test plots. Animals are bred selectively, their traits recorded across generations. Diseases are isolated and studied rather than simply endured. Waste is measured, repurposed, and reduced. Even manure becomes data. Walking through the facilities feels less like visiting a farm and more like entering a research campus. Buildings are labeled by function, not by owner. Some rooms smell of chemicals and disinfectant. Others hum with machinery. Others are silent, except for scratching pens and ticking clocks. Time itself feels managed here. Workers are expected to follow procedures exactly. Innovation is welcome, but only within structure. Deviations are noted. Accidents are analyzed. Success is replicated. For many laborers, this offers stability rare in rural life. Regular wages replace seasonal uncertainty. Training replaces tradition. Yet the cost is constant supervision and limited autonomy. The leaders of the empire see this as necessary. In their view, progress requires discipline. Waste is a moral failure. Randomness is inefficiency. The land must be taught to behave. This mindset mirrors the factories and rail systems transforming the nation. What makes it unsettling is seeing the same logic applied to living soil and animals. By the turn of the century, the empire stands as one of the most complex private agricultural systems ever assembled. Its output feeds cities, its research influences policy, its methods begin to appear in textbooks. Yet most Americans never hear its name. There is no skyline to photograph, no single structure defines it. It exists as a network, difficult to capture in one image or headline. This invisibility becomes part of its strength and its weakness. Without spectacle, there is less scrutiny. Without public fascination, there is also little protection. The empire depends on a political climate that tolerates vast private control as long as it remains quiet and useful. As the nation moves forward, that climate will not remain stable. The same forces that celebrate efficiency will soon question concentration. The same belief in progress will begin to fear imbalance. For now, the system hums smoothly, confident in numbers, records, and routines. Standing at the edge of the fields at dusk, you hear machines settling into night cycles. Lights glow from laboratories, trains wait at loading points. Nothing here suggests fragility. Everything suggests permanence. Yet history often turns not on what is visible, but on what remains unseen. An empire has formed that does not look like power as Americans expect it. It feels rational, controlled, and inevitable. The question left hanging is not whether it works, but whether a nation built on individual ambition will accept a system that perfects ambition into something collective, disciplined, and vast. The system does not pause to reflect on its early achievements. From inside, there is no sense of arrival or completion. What exists instead is pressure. The larger the operation becomes, the more it must keep moving. Fixed costs accumulate relentlessly. Roads require constant repair. Drainage channels clog and must be cleared. Machinery wears down whether crops succeed or fail. Wages must be paid on schedule, regardless of weather or market prices. At this scale, motion is not ambition, it is survival. By the opening years of the 20th century, the empire crosses a point where size alone changes its relationship with the world. It no longer reacts to markets in the way smaller operations do. Instead, markets begin reacting to it. Grain buyers notice patterns forming in supply. Livestock traders experience fewer sudden shortages. Rail operators begin planning capacity around predictable volumes. None of this is announced. It happens quietly, through repetition and reliability. Expansion continues, but it is no longer driven by excitement or experimentation. Every new acre represents risk as much as opportunity. Survey teams are sent months in advance, sometimes years. They walk the land in every season. They record how water moves after heavy rain and how frost settles in low ground. Soil is tested repeatedly, not just for fertility, but for consistency. Land that cannot be standardized is rejected. no matter how inexpensive it appears. When land is approved, it is reshaped to fit the system rather than the other way around. Old boundaries are removed to simplify movement. Drainage is corrected where it creates unpredictability. Fields are resized to match machinery limits and labor flows. This process does not feel dramatic or violent. It is methodical. Nature is not confronted directly. It is adjusted until it behaves in ways the system can anticipate. Inside the organization, scale alters the meaning of responsibility. Individual managers no longer own outcomes in isolation. Their task is alignment. A failed harvest in one zone is acceptable if overall projections remain intact. Disease in one herd is contained, studied, and absorbed statistically. Loss is no longer treated as tragedy. It is treated as data. This shift strips emotion from decision-making. Sentiment has no role in a system this large. Land is valued for performance, not history. Animals are valued for output, not familiarity. Workers are assessed by consistency, not personality. Anything that cannot be measured precisely is viewed as a potential weakness. Coordination becomes the most valued skill. Managers are chosen for their ability to think across chains of cause and effect. A delay in planting affects harvest timing. Harvest timing affects storage capacity. Storage affects transport schedules. Transport affects contracts and pricing. One miscalculation can ripple outward for weeks. Precision is not praised. It is assumed. Time inside the empire feels different from the outside world. Days are rigidly structured, broken into shifts and tasks. Seasons are reduced to phases within longer cycles. Planners think years ahead, while workers follow hourly routines. The system demands both long vision and immediate obedience to schedules. As coordination deepens, the operation begins to resemble logistics more than agriculture. Fields function as inputs. Crops move through processing and storage like raw materials. Livestock is managed as inventory with predictable life cycles. Waste is tracked, measured, and redirected into fertilizer or fuel. Nothing is allowed to remain idle without explanation. This transformation reshapes how the outside world interacts with the empire. Buyers no longer negotiate around uncertainty. They negotiate around volume and timing. Reliability becomes more valuable than flexibility. When shipments arrive exactly as promised, month after month, trust forms. That trust gradually reshapes entire supply chains. Wholesalers begin organizing storage around expected deliveries. Processors schedule labor weeks in advance. Rail companies assign rolling stock based on predictable demand. None of these actors need instructions. Predictability reduces risk for everyone involved, and behavior adjusts accordingly. This reduction of risk becomes a quiet form of power. In markets historically shaped by weather and chance, the empire smooths volatility. Prices stabilize. Sudden shortages become rare. Surpluses are absorbed more evenly. Consumers benefit without understanding why conditions feel calmer. Yet stability carries hidden costs. Smaller producers once relied on variability to survive. A bad season for one could be offset by high prices during shortages. As large, consistent volumes enter the market, those opportunities fade. Margins tighten, flexibility loses its value. Nearby farmers feel this pressure first. Some attempt to adapt by purchasing machinery and adopting new methods. They attend training sessions influenced by techniques developed inside the empire. Without comparable capital or infrastructure, results vary widely. A few manage to grow and consolidate. Many struggle under debt. Failure becomes more visible and more isolating. Where farming once allowed room for imperfection, efficiency now defines worth. Those who fall behind are labeled resistant to progress rather than constrained by scale. The language of judgment replaces the language of circumstance. This shift changes rural relationships. Cooperation gives way to comparison. Neighbors measure yields against benchmarks set by an operation they cannot match. Pride becomes tied to numbers rather than endurance. The social fabric begins to thin. Inside the empire, labor experiences its own transformation. Employment is steady. Wages arrive predictably. Training programs formalize skills that were once learned informally. For many workers, this stability feels like progress. Rural life has rarely offered certainty. But stability comes with limits. Roles are narrow and repetitive. A worker may spend years performing a single task. Creativity is not forbidden, but it must pass through layers of approval. Suggestions are logged, tested, and evaluated before adoption. Individual judgment gives way to procedure. This structure produces efficiency, but it also creates distance. Workers are part of a system too large to understand fully. Pride shifts from personal craftsmanship to collective output. Success feels abstract. Failure feels impersonal. Leadership views this trade-off as necessary. Complexity, in their view, demands discipline. They believe scale without hierarchy collapses under its own weight. Control is not cruelty. It's coordination. Without it, the entire system would fracture. By the middle years of the decade, the empire reaches peak operational effectiveness. Output increases steadily year after year. Waste declines, losses shrink. Research conducted here begins influencing national conversations. Agricultural journals cite findings. Universities incorporate data into coursework. This intellectual influence extends the empire's reach far beyond its land. Even those who never buy its products adopt its assumptions. Farming becomes framed as optimization rather than stewardship. Success is measured in yield per acre and cost per unit. Risk tolerance narrows across the industry. As these ideas spread, expectations harden. Farmers are judged against standards set by an operation with immense resources. What was once innovation becomes obligation. Those who cannot comply are labeled inefficient or outdated. At the same time, the national mood begins shifting. The early 20th century brings growing suspicion of concentrated power. Trusts dominate headlines. Industrial giants are accused of manipulating markets and politics. Public confidence in large private systems erodes. Although this empire does not refine oil or smelt steel, the parallels become difficult to ignore. It controls supply chains. It shapes prices indirectly. It influences policy through expertise rather than force. Its power is quiet but deeply embedded. Newspapers begin to notice. Coverage mixes admiration with unease. Articles praise efficiency while hinting at danger. Questions appear subtly. Who benefits most? Who bears the cost? What happens if control continues to expand? Inside the leadership, opinions diverge. Some dismiss criticism as fear of progress. They believe results justify scale. Others sense vulnerability. They understand that data alone does not build trust. Narrative matters. The empire adapts its image carefully. Public communication increases. Tours emphasize education and service. Publications highlight contributions to national food security. Language shifts away from dominance toward stewardship and responsibility. Yet adaptation has limits. Efficiency leaves little slack. Global markets introduce volatility beyond local control. Imports pressure prices. Transport networks strain under demand. To maintain margins, the system tightens further, reducing buffers. This tightening introduces fragility. When everything is optimized, disruption spreads faster. A delayed shipment affects multiple partners. A labor shortage cascades through schedules. The system absorbs shocks only within narrow boundaries. By the end of the decade, the empire stands unmatched in scale and sophistication. It has reshaped agriculture, labor, and knowledge. Its methods are admired and quietly feared. It appears stable, yet increasingly exposed. Scale has transformed coordination into power. Reliability has become authority. Efficiency has reshaped expectations across an entire sector. But power gained through scale depends on acceptance. As public attitudes begin to shift, the qualities that built the empire also draw scrutiny that no amount of planning can fully contain. The pushback does not begin with a crisis you can point to on a calendar. It starts as a feeling inside the machine, a slight change in friction. The empire still plants, still harvests, still ships on time, and the ledgers still close neatly at the end of each week. Yet the people closest to the system sense that something outside the fences is shifting. The world that once rewarded pure efficiency begins to punish it in small, quiet ways. In the last years of the first decade of the 20th century, the market stops acting like a local thing. Prices no longer rise and fall, only with rain, frost, and regional supply. News from distant ports begins to matter. A shipment of grain landing across the ocean can lean on prices at home weeks later. The empire can manage soil and schedules, but it cannot manage the sea. Inside the planning offices, maps and charts spread across tables like battlefield diagrams. Managers mark rail junctions, storage capacity, and harvest windows. They used to forecast using weather history and local demand. Now they add strange new variables that do not belong to the land. Currency shifts, shipping insurance costs, foreign harvest reports. The numbers still look clean, but the meaning becomes less certain. The system reacts the only way it knows how. It tightens, it reduces waste further, it pushes labor and logistics toward even stricter timing. It hunts for extra efficiency like a hunter following a trail in low light. This works in the short term, but it also removes the soft padding the system once had. A machine tuned too tightly can perform beautifully, right up until it cannot. Rail networks that once felt like dependable arteries begin to show strain. Traffic grows across the nation as industry expands and cities demand more. Delays appear for reasons no farm manager can fix. A locomotive breaks down far from the empire, and suddenly a week of planning wobbles. Grain sits longer in storage than intended. Livestock shipments arrive late. A single missed slot forces a chain of compromises. The empire adapts by building buffers, but buffers cost money and space. Extra storage means capital tied up in buildings and maintenance. Extra rail capacity means negotiating with companies that have their own priorities. Every attempt to regain control creates a new dependency. The empire has always been proud of being self-contained. Now it must lean on external systems more often. At the same time, the public mood at home begins to change. Across the country, people grow wary of large private power. Newspapers report on trusts in steel, rail, and oil, and the language of reform spreads into ordinary talk. Efficiency no longer sounds purely modern. It begins to sound like domination. The empire in the countryside is not as famous as the industrial giants, but it shares a family resemblance. The empire used to be protected by its lack of spectacle. It had no skyline, no glittering towers, no single gate that symbolized its wealth. It was spread out, practical, and quiet, so it avoided the spotlight. But scale has a way of revealing itself. Local merchants notice who can buy supplies in bulk. County officials notice who controls employment. Traders notice who can steady prices. Quiet power still feels like power. Government attention arrives first as paperwork, not punishment. Officials request more detailed reports on output, land use, and labor structure. They ask questions that feel neutral in tone but sharp in implication. How much land is consolidated under one plan? How wages are set? How shipments influence regional prices? Each request is manageable, but together they signal a new relationship. The empire is no longer just producing, it is being measured from the outside. Inside the leadership, meetings become heavier. The people who once spoke confidently in projections now speak with caution. Lawyers begin attending discussions that used to belong only to planners and agronomists. Expansion proposals that once seemed straightforward now come with political risk. The empire has always trusted the logic of results. Now it learns that results do not automatically buy permission. Regulation rarely arrives as a single blow. It arrives as many small rules that alter the shape of the ground beneath your feet. A transport rule changes how rates are calculated, and suddenly a distant market is less profitable. A tax adjustment changes the cost of holding land, and suddenly expansion looks less wise. New reporting requirements demand time and staff, and suddenly managers spend more hours explaining work than doing it. Compliance becomes its own ecosystem. New clerks are hired, new files are created, new inspection routines are added to days already crowded with tasks. Every procedure must be written down, not just remembered. The empire has always loved documentation, but this is different. Internal records are for improvement. External records are for judgment. The same numbers now serve two masters. On the ground, workers start noticing the weight. Inspectors arrive with checklists. Managers walk more often with folders in hand. Processes that used to flow quietly are paused so someone can sign a form. The day still runs, but it runs with more stops. Efficiency becomes harder to feel because so much energy is spent proving that efficiency exists. Markets respond to uncertainty with caution. Buyers who once relied heavily on the empire begin spreading their contracts across multiple suppliers. They still respect reliability, but they no longer want dependence. They shorten commitments. They ask for escape clauses. They keep options open. The empire remains a major supplier, yet it senses that its central position is no longer secure. This shift affects the empire's internal planning. The system is built for long schedules and predictable volumes. Short contracts and shifting demand create turbulence. Turbulence forces planners to hold more inventory, which ties up money. or it forces them to risk shortages, which damages trust. Either way, the empire pays a price. Reliability can be a form of power, but it can also become a trap when the world stops behaving reliably. Cultural pressure grows alongside economic pressure. Farming, in the public imagination, still carries a romantic image of families and seasons, of local knowledge and tradition. The empire's scientific approach once looked like the future, and many still admire it, but critics begin framing it differently. They describe land treated like a factory floor. They describe animals managed like parts. They speak of a loss of connection. These criticisms do not accuse the empire of chaos or cruelty. The empire is clean, orderly, and often safer than smaller operations. The criticism is about meaning. It is about what kind of country people want. The empire can reply with numbers, but numbers do not answer moral questions. A ledger cannot explain why the public should feel comfortable with concentration. Inside leadership circles, disagreement deepens. Some leaders argue for quiet retreat, not surrender, but a controlled reduction of visibility. They believe scale has made the empire politically vulnerable, and that the system should shrink its footprint, diversify ownership structures, and lower its profile. Other leaders refuse this idea. They believe shrinking would validate critics and weaken the model forever. They argue that the best defense is continued success. This debate creates hesitation, and hesitation changes behavior. Expansion slows. Research budgets are reviewed more sharply. Investment decisions are delayed. Departments that once competed to innovate now compete to justify expenses. The system becomes cautious in a way it has never been. Caution protects the present, but it steals from the future. Labor becomes another point of pressure. Reform movements push for better conditions across industries, and rural work is not exempt. New rules appear for hours, safety, and documentation. The empire can comply, and in many cases it already exceeds basic standards. But compliance changes rhythm. Shifts must be adjusted, tasks must be redistributed. The careful timing that kept everything smooth now has new constraints. Managers face a difficult trade. A system optimized for tight scheduling hates slack. Slack looks like waste. But without slack, every small disruption becomes a crisis. The empire begins adding buffers back into a structure designed to remove them. Extra workers are trained to cover gaps. Extra time is inserted between steps. The system becomes slightly less efficient on paper, but more stable in practice. Even with these adjustments, global competition continues pressing down on prices. Imports increase. Domestic producers in other regions expand. New transport links make distant markets more accessible to competitors. The empire still has advantages, but its dominance is no longer absolute. When prices fall, the empire feels it sharply because it carries heavy fixed costs. It cannot simply scale down overnight. Financial meetings take on a new tone. Planners who once spoke about growth now speak about resilience. They talk about reserves, insurance, and cost control. Maintenance becomes a higher priority than experimentation. Proven methods are favored. Risky research is questioned. The empire remains innovative, but innovation becomes incremental rather than bold. This shift changes the spirit of the place. The empire once felt like a frontier of science in the countryside, with a sense of forward motion. Now it begins to feel like a fortress. It is still productive, still organized, but it is watching the horizon. It is listening for political storms. It is reading newspapers the way soldiers read the sky for aircraft. Outside the empire, smaller producers adapt in a different way. Many stop trying to match scale and choose identity instead. They emphasize local quality, distinctive products, and personal reputation. This resonates with consumers who are uneasy about uniformity. Markets begin fragmenting. People pay for story, not just supply. The empire, built for volume and standardization, struggles to sell story without changing its core. The world is pushing back, not with a single enemy, but with a shifting landscape of markets, laws, and beliefs. The system must now choose between protecting its structure or transforming it. And transformation, for a machine built on control, may be the most dangerous experiment of all. The empire does not collapse when the world pushes back. It does something more difficult. It learns to bend without snapping. In the early years of the second decade of the 20th century, the leadership stops talking like builders and starts talking like guardians. The goal shifts from becoming bigger to remaining acceptable. The system still believes in efficiency, but it begins to understand that efficiency alone no longer protects it. The first changes are small on the surface but deep in meaning. Expansion plans are quietly shelved, not announced as defeat, but treated as prudence. Land purchases slow, then stop. Capital that once went into new acreage is redirected into strengthening what already exists. Maintenance budgets rise. Zapas, or emergency reserves, become a priority even when they hurt short-term profit. Inside planning meetings, the language of certainty softens. Forecasts become ranges instead of fixed numbers. Managers build schedules that assume disruption will happen. Storage is used less like a pipeline and more like a shield. The empire begins placing value on slack again, even though slack once looked like waste. It is an uncomfortable change, like loosening armor to breathe. A new kind of map appears on office tables. It is not only a map of fields and roads, it is a map of relationships. Rail companies, county officials, newspapers, wholesalers, inspectors, schools, and banks. The empire starts to see that it is not just producing crops, it is producing trust. And trust has its own supply chain. Every outside partner becomes a point of weakness or strength. The leadership also begins separating what the public fears from what the empire wants to keep. Scale is the part that draws suspicion. Knowledge is the part that draws admiration. So the empire leans into knowledge. Research facilities receive more attention, not because experiments are cheaper, but because they can be framed as public good. The empire starts presenting itself as an educational force rather than a private machine. This reinvention shows up in the way visitors are handled. Tours become more frequent, but also more carefully designed. Guests are guided toward labs, test plots, and training rooms. They are shown results that look generous and civic-minded. The message is clear, even without speeches. This place is not a private fortress. It is a model that can help others. Training programs expand beyond the empire's own workforce. Local farmers are invited to learn methods, not just observe them. Demonstration plots are built near public roads where results can be seen without a gate. Pamphlets and bulletins circulate through agricultural networks. The empire does not give away everything, but it gives enough to shift the story from control to contribution. At the same time, the empire adjusts its structure to look less like a single fist. Ownership and management layers become more complex, partly for legal reasons and partly for optics. Some operations are reorganized into separate units, each with its own accounting and oversight. The system remains connected, but the connections become less obvious. Power does not disappear, it becomes harder to point at. Labor policies change as well, both from pressure and from calculation. With new rules shaping hours and conditions, the empire chooses compliance as a form of defense. It improves housing where it exists. It formalizes safety routines that were once informal. It invests in training that reduces accidents. These choices cost money, but they also reduce public risk and internal disruption. A stable workforce becomes part of legitimacy. Managers also learn to treat workers not just as scheduled inputs, but as sources of stability. Cross-training becomes more common. Crews are rotated so knowledge is shared across tasks. This reduces the empire's dependence on any single group or foreman. It also builds loyalty in a time when outside critics want to paint the system as cold. The empire does not become warm, but it becomes smarter. The supply chain is reworked with the same logic. Contracts with buyers are renegotiated to reduce the empire's exposure to sudden shifts. Instead of chasing every distant market, planners focus on routes that can be served reliably under new transport uncertainties. Some shipments are reduced on purpose, trading growth for predictability. This feels like stepping back from the edge, not because the empire is weak, but because the ground has changed. In the fields, the changes are visible if you know where to look. Crop choices shift toward resilience. The empire favors varieties that can handle volatility, even if yields are slightly lower. Planting schedules become more staggered to spread risk. Soil improvement projects continue, but now they are framed as long-term protection rather than pure productivity. The empire is building insurance into the land. Livestock operations are adjusted too. Herd sizes are balanced against feed uncertainty and market swings. Breeding programs continue. But selection now includes traits linked to hardiness and disease resistance more than maximum output. Veterinary routines tighten. Quarantine procedures become stricter. The empire treats biology like a frontier again, not a solved equation. Financial strategy also evolves. In earlier years, success created confidence, and confidence encouraged bold investment. Now leadership behaves like a banker in a storm. Debt is reviewed more critically. New loans are avoided when possible. Cash reserves are increased, even if that slows modernization. The empire begins measuring survival odds, not just profit margins. This new caution changes the tempo of innovation. Research does not stop, but it becomes more defensive. Experiments focus on reducing costs, improving storage, and preventing loss. Big visionary projects are harder to justify. The empire still believes in the future, but it no longer assumes the future will reward boldness. It begins preparing for a world that might punish it instead. Public messaging becomes a strategic tool. The empire does not advertise like a consumer brand, but it begins shaping narratives. Articles appear emphasizing education, food stability, and scientific progress. Partnerships with schools and agricultural societies grow. The empire places its name near institutions that people trust. It borrows legitimacy the way it once borrowed rail capacity. The empire also studies the reform movement, the way it studies weather. It tracks political trends, watches elections, reads speeches, and monitors public sentiment. This is new. It once believed politics could be treated as background noise. Now politics feels like a second climate system, with storms that can destroy harvests even when the sun shines. Inside county offices and state agencies, the empire becomes more present, not through loud lobbying, but through participation. It offers expertise, it provides data, it supports public efforts that align with its interests, such as disease control and infrastructure. These contributions are not purely generous, they are defensive walls built from cooperation. Still, reinvention has limits. The empire cannot fully hide its scale. People still see long convoys at harvest. They still hear machinery running late into the evening. They still notice how many families depend on wages from one organized network. Even if the empire acts more civic-minded, the basic fact remains. It is large and it is coordinated, and that triggers suspicion in a changing era. This is where the reinvention becomes more creative. The empire begins shifting some activities outward. It supports independent producers who follow its standards, using contracts and training rather than ownership. It creates a network effect that looks more distributed. Production appears less centralized, even if influence remains. The empire learns that control can exist through standards as well as through land. This approach requires trust in others, which is difficult for a system built on tight control. Standards must be enforced without direct command. Quality must be maintained without constant supervision. The empire develops inspection routines and incentive systems that encourage compliance. It becomes less like a single machine and more like a coordinator of many smaller machines. For local farmers, this creates a strange mix of opportunity and dependence. Some gain access to training and stable buyers. Others feel pressured to conform to a model they did not choose. Yet the empire's leaders see this as a compromise. It reduces political exposure while keeping supply steady. It is reinvention by diffusion. In the short term, the strategy works. The empire becomes harder to attack directly because it appears less like a single giant landholder. Its knowledge and methods are more visible than its ownership. Its influence remains real, but it looks more like leadership than domination. This softens scrutiny, not eliminating it, but dulling its edge. The end of the empire does not arrive as a scene of chaos. There is no smoke rising from barns, no crowds outside a gate, no front-page headline announcing a fall. What happens is quieter, slower, and far more effective. The system begins to unwind like a rope being loosened, one careful turn at a time. Each turn feels reasonable when it happens. Each step can be explained as prudence. Only later does it become clear that the disappearance was not an accident. It was engineered. By the later years of the second decade of the 20th century, the leadership no longer speaks like builders. In earlier years, the language inside meetings was full of certainty, growth, and ambition. Then it shifted toward defense, toward legitimacy, toward managing perception. Now it shifts again toward exit, without alarm. The system still functions and still produces. Yet the people closest to it understand that the world has changed too much. They do not ask how to protect the empire forever. They ask how to leave without leaving a target. The first phase is administrative fragmentation, because paperwork can erase faster than bulldozers. Central ledgers are divided into smaller books. Departments that once answered to one office now appear as separate units with different budgets and names. Contracts are rewritten under new entities. Payroll is reorganized so no single employer appears to dominate a county. These changes do not affect the harvest next week. They affect how the system is seen. Regulators, banks, and journalists no longer see one massive structure. They see many ordinary ones. This fragmentation is designed to survive inspection. If officials ask who owns what, the answer becomes complicated. If a reporter tries to follow ownership, the trail splits into leases, trusts, and holding arrangements. If a reformer wants a clear villain, there is no single face. The empire does not disappear physically at first. It disappears as a coherent object. It becomes harder to describe, which makes it harder to attack. Land ownership shifts next, and it is done with the same slow care. Large continuous holdings are broken into smaller parcels on paper. Some parcels are sold outright to locals or newcomers. Others are leased with long-term agreements that preserve control through conditions rather than title. Some are transferred into trusts that separate the land from the recognizable name of the empire. The fields still run according to familiar schedules, but the map of ownership becomes blurry. To people living nearby, these transactions feel normal. Land changes hands regularly. Families move. Banks foreclose. New investors arrive. A deed changing names does not look like history turning. Crops still rise in spring. Harvest still pulls crews into the fields at the same time each year. Wagons and rail cars still move. Nothing looks like a fall, so no one calls it one. The empire reduces its visible footprint with equal caution. A facility does not close suddenly. Its workload is reduced first. Workers are reassigned or shifted gradually. A building that once ran every day begins running 3 days a week, then 1 day, then only in peak season. Finally, it is sold or repurposed, often to a local operator who continues using it with little change. The structure remains busy, so there is no empty shell to signal loss. Infrastructure is not destroyed, because destruction creates memory. Infrastructure is absorbed. Roads become public routes. Storage sheds become local warehouses. Workshops become feed suppliers or machine repair shops. The empire's physical presence dissolves into ordinary rural life. People keep using the same buildings, but they forget what those buildings once represented. The landscape stays productive, which makes the transition feel like continuity. The most sensitive part is knowledge, because knowledge is the one thing the empire once used to justify itself. In earlier years, it leaned into research and education to build legitimacy. Now it leans into them for camouflage. Research units are moved closer to universities and public agencies. Scientists who once worked under the empire's banner begin publishing under broader affiliations. Demonstration plots are presented as cooperative projects. Discoveries are credited to institutions rather than a single private system. This transfer is not purely generous, it is tactical. When methods become public, suspicion fades. When everyone adopts similar techniques, the origin becomes less important. The empire learns that secrecy once protected advantage, but openness now protects survival. By letting its ideas spread, it makes itself harder to identify. If the future looks collective, the past becomes harder to trace. Labor is handled the same way. Concentrated employment is dangerous because it attracts scrutiny and resentment. The empire reduces the appearance of being the dominant employer by breaking work into smaller contracts. Crews are hired through intermediaries. Some operations are spun into independent firms that still follow the empire's standards. Workers who once received one paycheck now receive pay through multiple sources, even if the work remains tied to the same network. To the worker, life changes in small ways. The schedule feels less stable, benefits may shift, a familiar foreman may now answer to a different name on paper. But the fields still need hands. The work still exists. The empire does not abandon labor. It rearranges labor so it looks like ordinary rural employment, not centralized power. This diffusion changes how communities perceive dependence. When one employer dominates, everyone knows it. When many small employers exist, dependence is harder to name. The empire's leaders understand this deeply. They have learned that a system can retain control through standards, training, and contracts, even when it no longer owns every acre or signs every paycheck. The financial core of the empire also shifts in a way that the public rarely notices. Wealth becomes mobile. Profits are redirected into other sectors that attract less suspicion. Investments spread into transport, finance, manufacturing, and services. The agricultural operation becomes only one part of a broader portfolio. This reduces political risk because critics cannot focus on one visible symbol. Money becomes quiet again. Timing amplifies the effect. The nation is entering years of upheaval and distraction. War and its consequences reshape priorities. Industrial acceleration dominates attention. Reform movements compete with urgent crises. Public memory shortens. People look for dramatic villains and dramatic rescues. A gradual administrative vanishing does not fit the emotional needs of the moment. During these years, the empire relies on the noise of history as cover. When headlines are filled with national issues, local shifts seem small. When families worry about prices, jobs, and distant events, they do not track who owns which parcel of land this year. The empire's disappearance is easier because the nation's attention is elsewhere. Even when people notice changes, they interpret them as modernization. They see new names on companies and assume business is simply evolving. They see cooperative research programs and assume progress is becoming more public. They see smaller farms adopting advanced techniques and assume knowledge is spreading naturally. They do not see the underlying design because the design is meant to resemble normal life. By the early years of the third decade of the 20th century, the empire as a recognizable entity is effectively gone. There is no ceremony, no announcement, no final meeting recorded for posterity. The system stops being named. In its place are farms, research stations, suppliers, and contracts that look ordinary. A visitor driving through the region sees productivity, not ruins. The lack of ruins is the key. If there were abandoned buildings, people would ask why. If fields lay fallow, newspapers would notice. If workers were suddenly unemployed, anger would rise. But the empire avoids these triggers. It dissolves while continuing to function, like a river changing course without drying up. The landscape remains alive, so memory does not activate. This makes historians' work difficult later. History loves clean endings. It loves battles, bankruptcies, scandals, and dramatic collapses. A quiet dissolution leaves no simple story hook. Records exist, but they are scattered. Names change, units merge and split, files move between institutions, the narrative trail breaks into fragments. The people who once ran the empire help this forgetting, sometimes intentionally, sometimes simply by moving on. Executives retire quietly or shift into roles in finance, government, or education. Engineers and agronomists bring their methods elsewhere. They become respected professionals in new settings. Their expertise remains, but it is detached from its origin. The empire's brain is transplanted into the broader body of the nation. In rural communities, memory fades in a predictable pattern. Older residents remember the earlier days, but they remember them as work routines, not as political structures. They recall the way trains arrived on schedule, the way supervisors kept time, the way barns were placed with unusual precision. They tell stories, but stories soften into nostalgia. Without a clear moment of loss, those stories do not become warnings. They become background. Younger generations grow up inside the new normal. For them, the network of farms and suppliers has always existed this way. They do not know that there was once a center. They do not feel that something has disappeared, because disappearance was designed to look like continuity. Their sense of history begins where their own experience begins. Language changes to help this process. Words like empire and control vanish from local talk. Terms like modernization, reform, transition, and cooperation replace them. When the past is described, it is framed as early progress, an imperfect but necessary stage on the way to the present. That framing removes the idea of deliberate concentration. It makes the past feel inevitable rather than chosen. The empire is not destroyed by history in a visible way. It is dissolved into ordinary structures and everyday routines until it becomes impossible to point at. Its legacy continues through methods, standards, and networks, but its name and shape disappear. The most striking part is that this was not an accident. The nation did not simply lose track of it. The nation and the empire itself found it convenient to let it fade, because forgetting was safer than remembering. The last phase of the story does not begin with discovery, confession, or a sudden return of the forgotten name. It begins with ordinary life continuing as if nothing unusual ever happened. By the middle decades of the 20th century, the land that once belonged to a single coordinated empire still produces food, still follows efficient patterns, and still moves goods through familiar routes. Research stations operate under institutional signs. Farmers use methods that sound scientific and modern. The result is a landscape that feels normal, and what feels normal rarely invites questions. In records, the empire is still present, but not in a form that wants to be found. The paper trail exists in fragments. Names shift. Departments become separate companies. Companies merge and vanish. Land parcels that once formed one continuous map become scattered under dozens or hundreds of owners. A researcher can reconstruct the story, but only by resisting the natural tendency to follow simple lines. This history does not offer a straight road. It offers a maze. The empire disappears from memory partly because it was designed to disappear, but also because America is not built to remember systems. America remembers pictures. It remembers buildings, scandals, and battles. It remembers the bright symbols of wealth and the sharp symbols of conflict. The rural empire left neither. It left functioning infrastructure and techniques that blended into the landscape. What continues to work rarely becomes a public mystery. By the mid-20th century, the country is busy building new symbols. The national imagination shifts toward assembly lines, wartime production, highways, suburban housing, and consumer abundance. Progress becomes associated with speed, scale, and visible output. Agriculture, in popular telling, becomes a background success. It is framed as something improved by technology, public research, and broad distribution of knowledge. The story emphasizes tractors, fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and university extension services. In this story, progress belongs to the nation, not to a private empire. This narrative is comforting in a specific way. It flatters democracy. It suggests that knowledge spreads naturally and fairly, that innovation is shared, that no single private system ever held decisive control of essential resources. It implies that abundance is the product of collective effort and public institutions. The Forgotten Empire complicates this comfort. It reveals that some progress was born from concentrated capital, centralized coordination, and long-term planning that did not require public permission. Forgetting simplifies the past into something easier to admire. The people who carried the empire's methods into the wider world rarely correct this simplification. Many do not see themselves as agents of a vanished empire. They see themselves as professionals continuing their work under new conditions. Agronomists move into universities, engineers become consultants, managers join government agencies and write standards. They teach methods without reciting origins. In their minds, what matters is that the method works. Over time, their knowledge becomes detached from the place that refined it at scale. That detachment feels natural because knowledge is expected to be portable. When a technique improves yields, society treats it as a common good. Yet portability also erases responsibility. When no one remembers who first organized power at enormous scale, it becomes easier to believe such organizations simply emerged from general progress. The empire's disappearance lets the nation claim the benefits of coordination, without confronting the discomfort of how coordinated power once was. As decades pass, the empire's influence becomes harder to separate from the background assumptions of modern life. The idea that land should be measured and optimized becomes common sense. The expectation of stable supply becomes an invisible promise. People grow accustomed to predictable abundance and treat it as normal, even though it is engineered. The empire helped prove that engineering was possible. Forgetting that proof makes the modern world feel inevitable. This is where the story turns deeper, because memory is not only about facts. It is about what a society believes is possible and what it believes is dangerous. If the public forgets that a private rural empire once coordinated land, labor, research, and logistics at enormous scale, then modern coordination looks new. It looks like something that arrived with computers or global corporations. It also looks like something that can be managed easily through rules and oversight because it seems unfamiliar. In truth, the basic logic is older than many people realize. In the later 20th century, wealth becomes more abstract than ever before. It moves away from land and factories and into corporate equity, finance, and global networks. Power becomes less connected to visible ownership and more connected to control of systems. Supply chains stretch across continents. Corporations manage information, transport, labor, and markets with coordination that would have seemed astonishing in earlier decades. The forgotten empire begins to look like a prototype, an early rehearsal for a world where power hides in organization rather than monuments. Yet this similarity does not bring the empire back into memory. It buries it further. When a pattern becomes common, people assume it has always existed. They stop asking who first created the template. They stop looking for the moment when the countryside began operating like an industrial network. Normality becomes a curtain. America also chooses to remember the Gilded Age through morality plays. Public stories emphasize excess and reform. Robber barons build fortunes, abuse power, and trigger backlash. Progressive movements rise. Antitrust action, regulation, and taxation appear. The lesson feels simple and emotionally satisfying. Excess was punished. Balance returned. Democracy corrected itself. The rural empire does not fit that story. It was not a glittering villain. It did not dominate headlines. It often framed itself as scientific service. It adapted rather than fought. It dissolved rather than collapsed. Its existence suggests that reform does not always destroy concentration. Sometimes reform teaches concentration how to become quieter, more distributed, more difficult to challenge. Remembering that possibility weakens the comfort of the morality play. This discomfort is a powerful force in collective forgetting. A society does not only forget what it cannot find, it forgets what it does not want to carry. The rural empire suggests continuity between past and present forms of power. It suggests that inequality can survive by changing shape. It suggests that public anger may reduce visible excess while leaving underlying advantage intact. These are difficult lessons. They demand attention to systems, not just to individuals. In modern debates about inequality, visible symbols still dominate. Mansions, private jets, luxury spending, and celebrity lifestyles become the targets because they are easy to picture. Systemic power remains harder to discuss because it is technical and distributed. Ownership structures, trust arrangements, contract networks, and policy influence feel abstract. The Forgotten Empire belongs to that abstract category. It is a story about how power can live inside paperwork and routines, which makes it less likely to become popular memory. If you return physically to the land that once carried the empire's core, you will not find a monument explaining its history. You find useful buildings and working fields. Roads follow efficient routes. Barns sit where they are practical. A research station might stand nearby, described as public service. The landscape communicates productivity, not narrative. It offers no spectacle. It does not demand to be remembered. This is why forgetting becomes so easy, and why it becomes a choice even when people do not think they are choosing. Remembering would require effort. It would require connecting details across decades, reading old records, and admitting that something large once existed in a form that contradicts comforting stories. Forgetting requires nothing. It fits smoothly into daily life. Institutions reinforce this forgetting through how they teach and record knowledge. Agricultural education focuses on best practices without tracing their origins. Policy papers cite outcomes without describing formation. Economic analysis emphasizes efficiency and yield, not the social shape of power that produced them. Over time, the empire's influence remains embedded in methods while its identity disappears from the stories that guide public understanding. Even historians face barriers. Researching a system designed to fragment itself requires unusual patience and synthesis. It demands following corporate reorganizations, land records, and scattered institutional archives. It lacks the dramatic hooks that attract attention. There is no single crisis point that forces research. The story does not present itself as urgent because the landscape remains functional. This is one reason it stays in the shadows. The empire's final success is not merely that it avoided collapse, it is that it avoided becoming a symbol. It never became a widely recognized villain. It never became a cautionary monument. It never became a famous building. It became ordinary. And ordinary things rarely become the center of national memory. This matters because the empire's disappearance shaped the nation's future expectations. When people believe progress is always public and widely distributed, they underestimate how often progress has been driven by concentrated coordination. When people believe reforms end empires, they miss how empires can adapt. When people focus on visible wealth, they neglect the quieter wealth of control over systems. The story of the rural empire shows something unsettling about democratic societies. Public pressure works best against what it can see. When wealth is displayed, it can be shamed and taxed. When control is centralized openly, it can be regulated. But when power becomes distributed across contracts, institutions, and standards, it becomes harder to confront. It looks like normal life, and normal life feels legitimate by default. This is the deeper reason America chose to remember other things instead. The nation prefers memories that offer clarity. It prefers villains you can name and reforms you can celebrate. It prefers stories where the past was corrected and the present is fairer. The rural empire offers a messier truth. It suggests that the shape of power changes faster than the public's ability to recognize it. There's also a cultural preference for individual stories. Americans often explain history through personalities: the tycoon, the reformer, the politician, the inventor. Systems are harder to personalize. The rural empire was primarily a system. It was not one man standing on a balcony. It was hundreds of routines, thousands of acres, and endless records. It cannot be reduced easily to one face. That makes it harder to narrate, and what is hard to narrate is easier to forget. Even the modern celebration of philanthropy echoes this logic. Funding research and public programs can be genuine service, but it can also shape narrative and legitimacy. The empire used education and public cooperation as part of its reinvention. Later, wealthy actors do similar things. They build institutions, fund universities, and support public initiatives. The public sees service and often stops asking deeper questions about control. This is another reason the rural empire matters. It shows that the strategy is not new. The story closes with a quiet recognition rather than a dramatic verdict. The empire did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it succeeded at becoming invisible. Its methods lived on. Its influence spread into public institutions and common practice. Its assets and operations dissolved into ordinary ownership patterns. Only the name and the coherent shape disappeared. America chose to forget it because remembering would demand a different way of thinking. It would demand attention to systems rather than symbols. It would demand admitting that progress can come from concentrated power, and that concentrated power can survive reform by changing shape. It would demand looking at the present and seeing echoes rather than novelty. The land still produces. The methods still exist. The assumptions the empire proved are now built into modern life. Only the name is missing. And that missing name is not a simple gap. It is the final design choice of an empire that learned the most durable form of power is not the kind that builds higher, but the kind that becomes so ordinary that no one thinks to ask who designed it in the first place.